She arrived in Blackwater Ridge with nothing but dirt under her fingernails and a grief so deep it carved shadows into her face. The widow nobody wanted, the woman they called trail trash, but when the savage black stallion that had killed 2 men knelt before her in the dust, the entire frontier knew something impossible had just begun. This is the story of Ara Holloway and the cattle baron who learned that some things aren't meant to be broken. They're meant to be saved. If you want to see how far love can reach across the wreckage of the past, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The wagon had stopped moving 3 days ago. Ara Holloway sat in the back of the abandoned supply cart, staring at the wooden slats that had once held flour sacks and dried meat, now emptied by desperate travelers who'd taken everything that wasn't nailed down. The canvas top flapped loose in the wind, torn during the storm that had killed her husband. She could still hear the crack of thunder, the scream of the oxen as they'd bolted, the sickening sound of Thomas hitting the rocks below the ravine. She'd climbed down to him in the rain, held his hand while he bled out in the mud, his last words a whispered apology she didn't deserve. 2 months before that, their infant son had stopped breathing in her arms during a fever neither of them could fight. No doctor, no medicine. Just a tiny grave marked with stones somewhere back on the trail she'd never see again. The river stone in her pocket pressed against her hip. Thomas had picked it up weeks before he died, smooth and gray, saying they'd use it for the foundation of their new home. She'd laughed then, believed him. Now it was just another useless weight she carried because letting go of it meant admitting none of it had been real. Ara pulled herself out of the wagon and started walking. The town of Blackwater Ridge appeared on the horizon like a broken promise. 20 buildings, maybe less, scattered along a dried-up creek bed that only ran water 2 months out of the year. Cattle pens stretched behind the main street, filled with restless longhorns that kicked up dust thick enough to choke on. The saloon stood on one corner, the general store on the other, and between them sat a row of wooden structures that looked like they'd been hammered together by men too drunk or too tired to care about straight lines. She walked down the center of the street with her bundle tucked under one arm, feeling every pair of eyes that landed on her. A woman in a faded calico dress crossed to the other side of the road. 2 men on the saloon porch stopped talking and just stared, their expressions flat and cold. A child pointed at her from a doorway until his mother yanked him back inside and slammed the door. Ara kept walking. The general store smelled like leather and tobacco and something sour she couldn't identify. The man behind the counter was heavy-set with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. He looked her over once, then went back to sorting nails into a wooden tray. "I'm looking for work," Ara said. He didn't look up. "Not hiring." "I can sew, I can cook, I can—" "Not hiring," he repeated, louder this time. "And we don't take in strays. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for wages. You'll work for nothing because nobody here wants you." He finally met her eyes, and there was no sympathy in them, just irritation. "Trail trash blows into town every few months thinking we owe them something. We don't. Move along." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she wasn't trash, that she'd been a wife and a mother and a woman with a future until the frontier had ripped it all away. But the words stuck in her throat, heavy and useless. So she turned and walked out. The next 2 places weren't any better. The seamstress told her she already had help. The boarding house owner took one look at her worn dress and muddy boots and said she didn't rent to drifters. By the time the sun started sinking behind the hills, Ara had been turned away from every door in town. She sat on the steps of the defunct church at the edge of the settlement, staring at the cattle pens in the distance. Beyond them, miles out, she could see the dark shape of a ranch house rising from the valley floor. Blackthorn Ranch. She'd heard the name whispered in town like it carried weight. Caleb Blackthorn. The man who owned half the territory and answered to no one. If the town wouldn't take her, maybe the wilderness would. Ara started walking again. The road to Blackthorn Ranch cut through open prairie that stretched so wide it made her chest ache. She'd been walking for over an hour when the first fence posts appeared, tall and dark against the fading light. The land beyond them rolled in long waves of dry grass, dotted with cattle that moved in slow clusters across the hills. She followed the fence line until the road turned toward a cluster of buildings, barns, bunkhouses, corrals, and at the center of it all, a 2-story ranch house built from dark timber and stone, A man stepped out of the largest barn as she approached. He was tall and lean, with a face like a hatchet and eyes that didn't blink often enough. He wore a foreman's hat and carried a coiled rope over one shoulder. "Lost?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he didn't care. "I'm looking for work." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You and every saddle tramp between here and the Missouri. Turn around." "I'm not a saddle tramp. I need steady work. I can cook, clean, mend. We got all that covered." He stepped closer, and she caught the smell of whiskey and sweat. "What we don't got is room for desperate widows looking for handouts." "I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for a job." "Same thing," he said, and turned his back on her. "Get off the property before I have the hands run you off." Ada stood there, fists clenched, rage boiling up so hot and sudden she almost said something stupid. But before she could, another voice cut through the air. "Silas!" The foreman froze. A man emerged from the shadows near the house, moving with the kind of ease that came from owning everything around him. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, his face weathered by sun and wind, deep lines carved around his mouth and eyes. He wore work clothes, not the fancy suits she'd seen on other ranchers, and his boots were scuffed with the same dust that covered the pens. But there was no mistaking who he was. Caleb Blackthorne. He looked at her, then at Silas. "What's going on?" "Nothing, boss, just sending off another drifter." Caleb's gaze moved back to Ada. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just studied her like he was trying to read something written in a language he didn't quite understand. She met his eyes and didn't look away, even though her legs were shaking and her throat was dry as dirt. "You come from town?" he asked. "Yes." "They send you out here?" "No, they sent me nowhere." Something shifted in his expression, just a flicker, like he'd heard an echo of something he recognized. "What's your name?" "Ara Holloway." "You got people? Ara Holloway?" She swallowed hard. "No." "Where's your husband?" "Dead." The word sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for just a second she thought she saw something crack behind his eyes. Then it was gone, locked down tight again. "How long you been walking?" "All day." "You eat?" "Not since yesterday." He glanced at Silas, whose expression had darkened into something close to anger. Then Caleb looked back at Ada, his voice flat and deliberate. "Kitchen's behind the house. Tell Mary to give you a plate. After that, you sleep in the spare room off the cookhouse. Tomorrow morning, you work." Silas stepped forward. "Boss, we don't need—" "I didn't ask what we need," Caleb said, his tone colder now. "I told you what's happening." Silas's mouth pressed into a hard line, but he didn't argue. He just shot Ada a look that promised trouble, then turned and stalked back toward the barn. Caleb started walking toward the house, and after a moment, Ada followed. He didn't look back, didn't speak, just led her around the side of the building to a smaller structure where smoke drifted from a chimney. Inside, a woman with gray hair and flour on her apron looked up from a pot of stew she was stirring. "Mary," Caleb said. "This is Ada. She's working here now. Feed her." Mary blinked, clearly surprised, but nodded. "Yes, sir." Caleb turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. He looked at Ada one more time, and this time his voice was quieter. "You cause trouble, you're gone. Understood?" "Understood." He left without another word. Mary gestured to a bench near the fire. "Sit. You look half dead." Ada sat, and a moment later a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread appeared in front of her. She ate slowly, trying not to cry, trying not to think about the fact that this was the first kindness anyone had shown her in weeks. Mary didn't ask questions, just moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, occasionally glancing at Ada like she was trying to figure out what storm had blown her in. When the bowl was empty, Mary showed her to a small room at the back of the cookhouse. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the dark prairie. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in a long time. Ara lay down on the bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling, the river stone still heavy in her pocket. She didn't know why Caleb Blackthorne had let her stay, didn't know what he'd seen in her face that made him change his mind, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to waste the chance. The next morning, Ara woke before dawn to the sound of boots on wood and men's voices outside. She washed her face in the basin, tied her hair back, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The ranch was already alive with movement. Horses being saddled, cattle lowing in the pens, the clang of metal from the blacksmith's shed. She found Mary in the kitchen, already elbow-deep in biscuit dough. "What do you need me to do?" Ada asked. Mary looked her over, then nodded toward a pile of potatoes in the corner. "Peel those, then fetch water from the pump. After that, we'll see." Ada worked without stopping. She peeled potatoes until her hands cramped, hauled water until her shoulders burned, scrubbed pots until her fingers were raw. Mary didn't say much, but she didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. By midday, the kitchen smelled like roasted meat and fresh bread, and the ranch hands started filing in for their meal. They looked at Ada like she was an odd piece of furniture someone had moved into the room without asking. Most of them ignored her. A few muttered comments she pretended not to hear. Silas came in last, his eyes landing on her with a coldness that made her skin crawl. "Still here," he said. "Still working," Ada replied. His smile was thin and sharp. "Won't last." He took his plate and left, but the threat hung in the air long after he was gone. The days blurred together after that. Ada worked from dawn until long after dark, doing whatever Mary or Caleb asked. She hauled feed to the chickens, mended torn clothing, scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and kept her head down. The other workers barely spoke to her, and when they did, it was usually to bark orders or complain about something she'd done wrong. But she didn't argue, didn't complain. She just worked. Caleb rarely spoke to her directly. He was always moving, checking fences, overseeing cattle drives, meeting with buyers who rode in from distant towns. But sometimes, in the early morning or late evening, she'd catch him watching her from across the yard, his expression unreadable. She didn't know what he was thinking, and she didn't ask. 2 weeks in, Mary sent her out to the horse barn to fetch a saddle that needed mending. The barn was dark and warm, smelling of hay and leather and animal sweat. Ada found the saddle hanging on the wall near the back, but as she reached for it, she heard something. A low, guttural sound. Breathing, heavy and uneven. She turned slowly and saw it. A massive black stallion stood in the corner stall, its coat gleaming like oil in the dim light. It was watching her with eyes that burned, nostrils flared, muscles tense like it was about to explode. She'd heard the men talk about this horse. Nightfall. The stallion that had belonged to Caleb's brother, who'd died breaking it. The horse that had killed 2 men since then and nearly crippled a third. No one touched it. No one even went near it. Ada should have walked away, but she didn't. She moved closer to the stall, keeping her steps slow and even. The stallion snorted, ears pinned back, hooves shifting. She could see the scars along its legs, the wild fury in its eyes. "You're angry," she said quietly. The horse's head jerked. "I know," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what it's like." She stopped just outside the stall door, close enough to touch the wood, but not close enough to threaten. The stallion stared at her, breathing hard, every muscle coiled tight. But it didn't charge, didn't scream. It just stood there, watching her like it was trying to decide if she was another threat or something else entirely. Ara reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of bread she'd saved from breakfast. She broke off a small piece and held it out, her hand steady even though her heart was pounding. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. The stallion didn't move. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the horse took a step forward, then another. Its muzzle stretched toward her hand, nostrils flaring, testing the air. Finally, soft as a whisper, it took the bread from her palm. Ara exhaled, her whole body trembling. The stallion chewed, still watching her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, something inside her chest loosened. "That's it," she whispered. "You don't have to be afraid." A voice behind her made her jump. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She spun around to find Caleb standing in the doorway, his face tight with something between shock and fury. Behind him, 2 ranch hands stood frozen, staring at her like she'd just done the impossible. "I was just—" Ada started, but Caleb cut her off. "That horse has killed men. You understand that?" "I wasn't trying to ride him. I was just—" "You were just standing next to a stall that every hand on this ranch knows to avoid." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something quieter, but no less intense. "You don't go near that animal again. You hear me?" She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him the horse wasn't the problem. It was the way everyone treated it, like it was a monster instead of a creature in pain. But the look on Caleb's face stopped her. "Yes, sir," she said. He held her gaze for another long moment, then turned and walked out. The ranch hands followed, muttering to each other. Ara stood there alone, her heart still racing, and when she glanced back at the stall, the black stallion was watching her again. But this time, it wasn't fury in its eyes. It was something else. Over the next few days, the story of what had happened in the barn spread through the ranch like wildfire. The men looked at her differently now, some with suspicion, others with something closer to awe. Silas's hostility sharpened into something more deliberate. He started assigning her the worst jobs: hauling manure, scrubbing out water troughs in freezing temperatures, carrying feed sacks that weighed more than she did. She didn't complain. She just did the work. But every chance she got, she went back to the barn. She didn't get close to Nightfall's stall, not after Caleb's warning. But she stood nearby, just out of sight, and talked to the horse in a low, steady voice. She told it about the trail, about Thomas and the baby, about the river stone she still carried. She didn't know if the horse understood, but it listened. And slowly, day by day, the wild rage in its eyes began to soften. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the ranch settled into quiet, Ara found Caleb sitting on the porch of the main house, a glass of whiskey in his hand. She didn't mean to disturb him, but he looked up as she passed and said her name. Ara? She stopped. Yes, sir? He studied her for a moment, his expression hard to read. Why'd you come out here? To Blackthorn Ranch? To the frontier. She hesitated, then decided the truth was easier than a lie. My husband thought we could build something, a home, a future. And now? Now he's dead. She met his eyes. And I'm still here. Caleb nodded slowly, like that made sense to him. He took a drink, then set the glass down. You know what they say about this place? No. They say it's cursed, that anyone who tries to build something here loses it. He looked out at the darkening prairie, his jaw tight. My wife and daughter died of fever 5 years ago. Same week, same room. I couldn't save either of them. Ara's breath caught. She hadn't known that. Hadn't known he carried the same weight she did. I'm sorry, she said quietly. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was rough. I let you stay because I saw it in your face. The same thing I see in the mirror every morning. He looked at her then, and the raw pain in his eyes was so sudden and so deep it made her chest ache. You're running from ghosts, so am I. Difference is, I stopped running a long time ago. I just stand here and let them haunt me. Ara didn't know what to say to that, so she just stood there, the evening wind pulling at her skirt, and let the silence settle between them. Finally, Caleb stood. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She nodded and turned to go, but his voice stopped her one more time. Ara? She looked back. Don't go near that horse again. She didn't answer. She just walked away, the river stone heavy in her pocket, and wondered if Caleb Blackthorn understood that some things couldn't be left alone. Some things had to be saved. She went back to the barn anyway. Not the next day or the one after that, but 3 nights later when the ranch had gone quiet, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional restless shuffle of horses in their stalls. Ara moved through the darkness with careful steps, her breath visible in the cold air, and stopped outside Nightfall's stall. The stallion was awake, standing in the shadows with his head raised, watching her approach like he'd been expecting her. I know he told me to stay away, she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. But I don't think either of us listens very well. The horse snorted, ears flicking forward. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his muscles bunched like he was always ready to fight or run. But he didn't move away from the stall door. He just stood there, waiting. Ara pulled out another piece of bread from her pocket and held it through the slats. The stallion hesitated, then stepped closer, his muzzle soft against her palm as he took the offering. His breath was warm, and for just a moment, standing there in the dark with this wild, furious creature, Ara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. You miss him, don't you? She whispered. The one who rode you before. Nightfall's ears swiveled back, and his head lifted slightly, like the words had touched something deep and raw. Ara had heard the story from one of the older hands, a man named Roy, who didn't talk much but seemed less hostile than the others. Caleb's younger brother, Daniel, had been the one who'd first tried to break Nightfall. He'd been good with horses, patient and steady, and the stallion had started to trust him. Then one day during a storm, Daniel had taken the horse out to check fences and never came back. They'd found him at the bottom of a wash with a broken neck, Nightfall standing over him, wild-eyed and screaming. After that, the horse had never let anyone close again. "He didn't leave you on purpose," Ada said softly. "Sometimes people just go, and there's nothing anyone can do about it." The stallion lowered his head, and for the first time, Ada saw something other than rage in his eyes. She saw grief. She stayed there for a long time, just talking in a low, steady voice, until the cold started seeping into her bones and she had to go back inside. When she finally turned to leave, Nightfall made a sound, low and almost questioning, and she looked back at him. "I'll come back," she promised. "I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, Silas was waiting for her outside the cookhouse. "Heard you've been sneaking around at night," he said, his tone casual but his eyes hard as flint. "That's interesting." Ada kept her expression neutral. "I couldn't sleep. Went for a walk." "To the barn?" "Didn't know that was against the rules." "It is when you're messing with a horse that's already killed 2 men. Silas stepped closer, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "You think you're special because the boss let you stay? You're not. You're just another mouth to feed, and the second you become more trouble than you're worth, you're gone." "Then I'll make sure I'm worth it," Ada said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Silas's jaw tightened. "You got a smart mouth for someone with nowhere else to go. And you've got a lot of opinions for someone who doesn't own this place." For a second, she thought he might actually hit her. His hand twitched, and his face went dark with anger. But then Mary's voice called from inside the cookhouse, breaking the moment, and Silas took a step back. "Watch yourself," he said, his voice low and mean. "Accidents happen out here all the time." He walked away, leaving Ada standing there with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. She'd made an enemy. She knew that, but she also knew she wasn't going to back down. Not for him. Not for anyone. The work got harder after that. Silas found every excuse to make her life miserable. He sent her out to mend fences in the freezing rain, assigned her to haul feed sacks that left her arms screaming, and made sure she was always the last one to eat, scraping the bottom of the pot for whatever was left. The other hands noticed but didn't say anything. They just watched, waiting to see how long she'd last. But Ada didn't break. She worked through the pain, kept her head down, and every night, when the ranch went quiet, she went back to the barn. Nightfall started meeting her at the stall door, his wild eyes softening just a little more each time. She brought him bits of apple, carrots when she could steal them from the kitchen, and once, a handful of oats she'd pocketed during the morning feeding. He took them all, his muzzle gentle against her hand, and slowly, the rage that had defined him began to fade. One night, she opened the stall door. It was reckless. She knew that, but something inside her refused to believe the horse was beyond saving. She stepped inside, moving slowly, her hands open and empty. Nightfall backed into the corner, his whole body coiled tight, and for a moment she thought he might charge. But then he stopped. Just stopped. And stood there, trembling, watching her with eyes that begged her not to hurt him. "I'm not going to hurt you," Ada whispered. "I promise." She moved closer, one step at a time, until she was standing right in front of him. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on his neck. His skin twitched under her touch, muscles jumping, but he didn't move away. She stroked him gently, feeling the heat of his body, the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "You're not a monster," she said quietly. "You're just scared." Nightfall let out a long, shuddering breath, and then, impossibly, he lowered his head and rested it against her shoulder. The weight of it nearly knocked her over, but she stayed upright, wrapping her arms around his massive neck and holding on. And for the first time since she'd lost everything, Ada felt like she'd found something worth fighting for. She didn't hear Caleb until he spoke. "You've got a death wish." Ara turned, still holding on to Nightfall, and found Caleb standing just inside the barn, his expression caught between fury and something else she couldn't name. He didn't move closer, just stood there with his arms crossed, staring at her like she'd done something impossible. "He's not dangerous," Ada said, her voice steady even though her heart was racing. "He's just hurt. He's killed men, because they treated him like a monster." She kept one hand on Nightfall's neck, feeling the stallion's breathing even out under her touch. "If you expect something to be violent, it will be. But if you give it a reason to trust you, it might surprise you. Caleb's jaw worked, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he let out a slow breath and shook his head. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most stubborn. Can it be both? A ghost of a smile flickered across his face, gone almost before it appeared. He stepped closer, cautious, his eyes never leaving the stallion. Nightfall's head lifted, ears pinned back, and Ara felt the tension flood back into his body. Easy, she murmured, stroking his neck. It's all right. Caleb stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving between Ara and the horse. How long have you been doing this? Couple weeks? Every night? Most. He exhaled hard, running a hand through his hair. You know what would have happened if he'd kicked you, stomped you? You'd be dead before anyone even knew you were in here. But he didn't, Ara said quietly, because he doesn't want to hurt anyone. He just wants someone to see him. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. You're talking about the horse, right? She held his gaze. Am I? The silence stretched between them, heavy and raw. Nightfall shifted, his muzzle brushing against Ara's shoulder, and Caleb's eyes followed the movement. Then he took another step forward, slow and deliberate, and held out his hand. Let me try, he said. Ara hesitated, then nodded. Move slowly. Let him come to you. Caleb approached with the kind of care she'd never seen in him before, his hand steady, his voice low and quiet. Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you. Nightfall watched him with wary eyes, every muscle tense. But when Caleb stopped and just stood there, waiting, the stallion's ears flicked forward. He took one step closer, then another, and finally, slowly, he stretched his neck and touched his nose to Caleb's palm. Caleb's whole body went still. He stood there, frozen, as the horse breathed against his hand. Then, carefully, he reached up and stroked the stallion's neck, his fingers gentle. I'll be damned, he whispered. Ara smiled just a little. Told you. They stood there together in the quiet barn, the three of them, and for the first time since Ara had arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, the walls around Caleb seemed to crack just enough to let a sliver of light through. The next morning, Roy found Ara hauling water from the pump and stopped her with a raised hand. Boss wants to see you, Her stomach dropped. She followed him across the yard to the main house, where Caleb was standing on the porch with a ledger in his hands. He glanced up as she approached, then dismissed Roy with a nod. You're not in trouble, Caleb said, before she could ask. But we need to talk. All right. He set the ledger down and leaned against the porch rail, his arms crossed. What you did last night with Nightfall, that wasn't just luck. You've got away with him, something I haven't seen in anyone since my brother. Ara didn't know what to say to that, so she just waited. I want you to work with him, Caleb continued, not breaking him, just getting him used to people again, to being handled. Think you can do that? Yes, sir, she said without hesitation. Silas isn't going to like it. Silas doesn't like anything I do. Caleb's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. Fair point. He straightened, his expression turning serious again. But if something goes wrong, if that horse hurts you, it's on me. You understand that? I understand. And you're still willing to do it? Yes. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, you've got 2 hours every afternoon. Use them however you need to. But if I see you taking unnecessary risks, I'm pulling you off. Thank you, Ara said, and Pota said, and meant it. Caleb turned to go back inside, then paused. Ara, she looked up. Why are you really doing this? She thought about that, about the river stone in her pocket, and the baby she'd buried on the trail, and the husband who'd died thinking he'd failed her. She thought about the way Nightfall had rested his head on her shoulder, and the way it had felt to hold on to something alive and breathing and real. Because he deserves a second chance, she said quietly. And so do I. Caleb didn't respond, but something in his eyes softened, just for a second. Then he nodded and walked back into the house, leaving Ara standing there with her heart pounding and a tiny spark of hope flickering in her chest. From that day on, Ara spent every afternoon in the barn with Nightfall. She worked slowly, patiently, letting him set the pace. She brushed him, talked to him, walked him around the corral on a loose lead. He was still skittish, still prone to sudden bursts of fear when something startled him, but he never turned on her, never even tried. The hands started coming by to watch. At first, it was just Roy, leaning on the fence with his hat tilted back, muttering things like, "Never seen anything like it," under his breath. Then others joined, standing in quiet clusters, their skepticism slowly giving way to something closer to awe. Even Caleb came by sometimes, leaning against the barn door with his arms crossed, watching in silence. Silas stayed away. But Otto could feel his anger like a weight pressing down on the ranch, thick and ugly, and waiting for a chance to strike. Came on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after she'd started working with Nightfall. Ara was leading the stallion around the corral when she heard shouting from the far side of the yard. She tied Nightfall to the post and jogged over to find a crowd gathered near the equipment shed. In the center of it, Silas and Roy were facing off, their voices raised and fists clenched. "I don't care what she says," Silas was shouting. "That horse is dangerous, and letting her play around with it is going to get someone killed." "She's doing fine," Roy shot back. "Better than fine. That animal's calmer now than he's been in years." "Calmer?" Silas laughed, harsh and bitter. "He's a killer. Always has been, always will be. And when he finally snaps and takes her head off, it'll be on your conscience." "Enough," Caleb said, stepping into the circle. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "Both of you, back off." Silas turned to him, his face flushed with anger. "Boss, you're making a mistake. That woman doesn't know what she's doing, and that horse is going to hurt someone. We need to put him down before—" "Before what?" Caleb interrupted, his tone cold. "Before he proves you wrong?" The words landed hard, and Silas's expression twisted into something ugly. "This isn't about being wrong. It's about keeping people safe." "Then let me make this clear," Caleb said, stepping closer. "Ara stays. Nightfall stays. And if you've got a problem with that, you can pack your gear and get off my ranch." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Silas stared at Caleb, his jaw working, and for a moment Otto thought he might actually walk away. But then he smiled, cold and sharp, and nodded. "Understood, boss," he said, his voice tight, loud and clear. He turned and walked away, and the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Ara standing there with her pulse hammering in her ears. Caleb glanced at her, his expression unreadable, then followed Silas toward the barn. Roy sidled up next to her, his voice low. "You just made yourself a real enemy." "I know," Ara said quietly. "He's not going to let this go." "I know that too." Roy shook his head, then clapped her on the shoulder. "Well, if you're going down, at least you're going down swinging." She managed a weak smile, but the unease in her chest didn't fade. Silas was dangerous. She'd known that from the start. But now he wasn't just angry. He was threatened. And threatened men did stupid, reckless things. That night, Ara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Finally, she gave up and pulled on her coat, slipping outside into the cold darkness. The ranch was quiet, everyone else asleep, and she walked slowly toward the barn, needing the comfort of Nightfall's presence. She found Caleb there instead. He was sitting on a hay bale just outside the Stallion's stall, a bottle of whiskey in his hand and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He looked up as she approached, but he didn't seem surprised. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "No." He gestured to the space next to him. "Sit if you want." She sat, the hay prickling through her skirt, and for a while neither of them spoke. Nightfall shifted in his stall, his breathing soft and even, and the silence between them felt oddly comfortable. "I should have put that horse down years ago," Caleb said finally, his voice rough. "Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." "But you didn't." "No." He took a drink, then stared at the bottle like it held answers he couldn't find. "My brother loved that animal, spent months working with him, training him, talking to him like he was a person. And when Daniel died, it felt like putting the horse down would be like killing him all over again." Otto looked at him, at the grief etched into his face, and understood. "So you kept him?" "Yeah, kept him locked up, kept everyone away from him, and told myself I was doing the right thing." He laughed, bitter and tired. "But I wasn't doing it for the horse. I was doing it because I couldn't let go." "There's nothing wrong with that," Otto said quietly. "Isn't there?" Caleb turned to look at her, his eyes dark and raw. I've been holding on to ghosts for 5 years, Ara. My wife, my daughter, my brother. And every day I wake up and think maybe today I'll finally let them go. But I never do. She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to tell him she understood because she was doing the same thing. So she just reached into her pocket and pulled out the river stone, holding it in her palm where the moonlight caught its smooth surface. My husband picked this up on the trail, she said. Said we'd use it for the foundation of our new home. I've been carrying it ever since, even though there's no home and there never will be. Caleb looked at the stone, then at her. Why do you still have it? Because letting go of it feels like admitting none of it mattered, that he died for nothing, that I lost my son for nothing. Her voice cracked and she had to stop, swallowing hard. I know it's just a rock, but it's all I have left. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he set the bottle down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You know what I think? What? I think we're both fools. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was something almost gentle in his expression. But at least we're fools together. Ara smiled, just a little, and they sat there in the darkness, two broken people holding onto stones and ghosts, trying to figure out how to let the living back in. The days grew longer after that night in the barn, the sun rising earlier and setting later as spring pushed its way across the prairie. The work didn't get easier, but Ara found herself settling into the rhythm of it, her hands growing calloused and strong, her body adapting to the relentless demands of ranch life. She still spent her afternoons with Nightfall, and the Stallion had started letting her saddle him, though she hadn't tried to ride yet. That was a step neither of them were ready for. Caleb watched her progress with something that looked like cautious hope. He started joining her in the corral sometimes, not saying much, just leaning against the fence with his arms crossed while she worked. Once, she caught him smiling when Nightfall nuzzled her shoulder looking for treats, and when their eyes met, he looked away quickly, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. You're getting attached, Ara said one afternoon, brushing dust off Nightfall's flank. To the horse? Caleb asked. To the idea that things can change. He was quiet for a moment, then pushed off the fence and walked closer. Maybe I am. Is that so bad? No, she said, glancing at him over the stallion's back. But it's dangerous. Hope makes you vulnerable. And what's the alternative? Giving up? Some days that feels easier. Caleb moved around Nightfall, coming to stand beside her. He was close enough that she could smell the leather and dust on his clothes, feel the warmth of him in the cool air. I used to think that too, he said quietly. After my wife and daughter died, I wanted to just stop. Stop feeling, stop trying, stop everything. But you know what I learned? What? Stopping doesn't make the pain go away, it just makes you hollow. Ara looked up at him, at the lines around his eyes and the grief that still lived in his face, and she understood. They were both hollow, both carved out by loss. But maybe, just maybe, they were starting to fill back up with something real. The moment broke when Roy came jogging across the yard, his face tight with urgency. Boss, we got a problem. Caleb turned. What is it? Fence down on the north pasture. Looks like someone cut it. Cattle are scattering into the hills. Caleb's expression darkened. How many head? At least 50, maybe more. Hell. Caleb was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance to the barn. Get every man who can ride. We need to round them up before they hit rough country. Roy nodded and took off running. Ara tied Nightfall securely and followed Caleb, her heart pounding. Cut fences weren't accidents. Someone had done this deliberately. Within 20 minutes, the ranch was chaos. Horses were saddled, men were shouting, and Caleb was barking orders with the kind of authority that made everyone snap to attention. Ara stood near the barn, feeling useless, until Caleb spotted her. You know how to ride? He asked. Yes. Well enough to keep up? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Then get a horse. We need every hand we've got. She didn't waste time arguing. She grabbed a saddle and bridled one of the older mares, a steady roan named Dusty who'd seen more cattle drives than most of the men on the ranch. By the time she swung into the saddle, the rest of the crew was already moving out, a thunder of hooves and dust heading north. Ara kicked Dusty into a gallop and followed. The ride was brutal. They pushed hard through open prairie, then up into rolling hills where the terrain turned rocky and unforgiving. The cattle had scattered wide, panicked and confused, and rounding them up was like trying to catch smoke. Ara worked alongside Roy and two other hands, driving strays back toward the main herd, while Caleb and Silas pushed from the other side. She didn't see Silas much during the chaos, but every time she caught a glimpse of him, his face was twisted with something dark and mean. He was shouting at the other men, driving them harder than necessary. And once she saw him deliberately spook a group of cattle that Roy had just gotten under control, forcing them to scatter again. "He's making this worse," Roy muttered, riding up beside her as they chased down another stray. "On purpose." "Why would he do that?" Ada asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because he wants the boss to look bad. Wants to prove he's the only one who can keep this place running." Roy spat into the dust. "Man's got ambition that'll get people killed." They worked until the sun started sinking, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. By the time they'd rounded up most of the cattle and driven them back toward the ranch, everyone was exhausted, their horses lathered and blowing hard. Caleb rode at the front, his jaw set, and Ada could see the tension radiating off him in waves. They were halfway back when one of the younger hands, a kid named Tommy, came riding up fast from the rear. "Boss, we got trouble!" Caleb reined in hard. "What kind of trouble?" "Some of the herd broke off and headed toward the cliffs. Must be 20 head, maybe more." "Damn it!" Caleb looked around at his exhausted crew, then made a decision. "Roy, take the main herd back. Tommy, Silas, you're with me. Ara..." "I'm coming," she said, before he could tell her to go back. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. He nodded once and spurred his horse forward, and Ada followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cliffs rose up like jagged teeth on the northern edge of the property, a series of steep drops and narrow paths that cattle had no business being near. By the time they reached the area, the light was fading fast, turning everything into shadows and uncertain shapes. Ada could hear the cattle before she saw them, their panicked lowing echoing off the rock walls. "Spread out," Caleb ordered. "Drive them back slow. If they spook and run, they'll go right over the edge." They split up, each taking a different angle. Ada moved carefully, guiding Dusty along the narrow path, her eyes straining to see in the dim light. The cattle were bunched up near a drop-off, their eyes rolling white with fear, and she could see why. The ground here was unstable, loose gravel and crumbling rock that shifted under their hooves. She was easing them back, inch by inch, when she heard a shout. It was Tommy, his voice high and scared. "The ground's giving way." Ara turned just in time to see a section of the cliff edge collapse, taking two steers with it. They went over in a cascade of dust and rock, their bellows cut short by the sickening impact below. The rest of the herd panicked, surging forward, and suddenly everything was chaos. "Move them! Now!" Caleb was yelling, trying to head off the stampede before it turned into a bloodbath. Ara kicked Dusty forward, putting herself between the cattle and the cliff edge, waving her arms and shouting. The mare responded beautifully, pivoting and lunging, using her body to block the terrified steers. But there were too many of them, and they were too scared, and Ada could feel the ground shifting beneath her, could hear the ominous creak of rock about to give way. Then she heard hoofbeats, fast and coming from the wrong direction. She turned and saw Silas riding hard toward the herd, not slowing down, not trying to calm them. He was driving them forward, deliberately pushing them toward the edge, and his face in the dying light was twisted with something that looked like satisfaction. "Silas, stop!" Caleb's voice roared across the cliffs, but Silas didn't stop. He rode straight into the herd, scattering them, and the cattle surged forward in a blind panic. Ada saw it happening like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. The steers hit the unstable ground near the edge, and it started to crumble, a chain reaction of collapsing rock and sliding gravel. She tried to turn Dusty away, but there were cattle everywhere, pressing in from all sides, and the mare stumbled. Then something black and massive exploded out of the shadows. Nightfall. The stallion came out of nowhere, moving like a force of nature, his hooves striking the ground with enough power to shake the earth. He charged straight into the panicked herd, his body a wall of muscle and fury, and the cattle broke around him like water hitting stone. He drove them back, away from the edge, his screams cutting through the chaos, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. Ara stared, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't brought nightfall, hadn't even considered it, but somehow the stallion had broken free and followed them, and now he was doing what no human could do, turning the stampede through sheer wild force. Caleb was there too, riding alongside Nightfall, his face set with grim determination as they pushed the herd back from the cliff. Tommy joined them, and together they managed to get the cattle moving in the right direction, away from the drop-off and back towards safer ground. But the damage was already done. As the dust settled and the cattle finally calmed, Otta saw Nightfall standing near the edge of the cliff, his sides heaving, his head lowered. And then she saw the blood. "No!" she whispered, sliding off Dusty and running toward him. "No, no, no!" The stallion's right front leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly shattered. He must have stepped wrong during the chaos, must have hit the unstable ground, and now he was standing there on 3 legs, trembling with pain and shock. Caleb dismounted and came up beside her, his face going pale when he saw the injury. "Hell!" he breathed. "We have to help him," Otta said, her voice shaking. "We can splint it. We can—" "Otta," Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "That's not a break we can fix. Not out here. Not for a horse. Then we bring him back to the ranch. We get a vet. There's no vet within 2 days' ride, and even if there was, a shattered leg like that—" He trailed off, his jaw working. "He's in pain. The kindest thing we can do is end it." "No!" Otta stepped in front of Nightfall, her hands shaking. "No, you're not shooting him." "Ara, be reasonable. He saved us." Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "He saved those cattle. He saved you, and now you want to kill him?" "I don't want to," Caleb said, and there was real anguish in his voice. "But keeping him alive like this is cruel. You know that." "I don't care." She planted herself between Caleb and the horse, her whole body shaking with rage and grief. "You're not touching him." Caleb stared at her, and she could see the conflict tearing him apart. Behind them, Tommy and Silas had gathered, their faces grim. Silas looked almost pleased, and that made Ara's fury burn even hotter. "This is your fault," she said, turning on him. "You drove those cattle toward the edge on purpose." Silas's expression didn't change. "I was trying to get them away from the cliff." "You're a liar." "Careful," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're talking about things you don't understand." "I understand plenty," Otta shot back. "I understand you've been trying to get rid of me since the day I got here. I understand you're so scared of losing your place on this ranch that you'd risk killing people to keep it. And I understand that you did this." "That's enough," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the argument like a whip. He looked at Silas, and there was something cold and final in his expression. "Get back to the ranch. Now." "Boss, Now." Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He swung back into his saddle and rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving the rest of them standing there in tense silence. Caleb turned back to Otta. "We still need to deal with the horse." "Then deal with me first," she said, her voice hard. "Because I'm not moving." They stood there facing each other, the dying light painting everything in shades of red and gold, and Ara could see the moment Caleb made his decision. His shoulders dropped, and he let out a long, defeated breath. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll try. But if he can't make it back to the ranch, if he's suffering too much, I'm ending it. And you're not going to stop me. Understood?" Ara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Getting Nightfall back to the ranch was the longest, most agonizing journey of Ara's life. They fashioned a makeshift splint from branches and rope, trying to stabilize the leg enough that he could move without making it worse. The stallion was in agony, every step a visible struggle, but he kept going. He trusted her. And that trust was the only thing keeping him alive. Caleb rode beside her the whole way, his face carved from stone, and she knew he was preparing himself for the moment when they'd have to stop. When the pain would be too much, and the only merciful choice would be a bullet. But that moment never came. Nightfall kept moving, one agonizing step at a time, until finally, hours later, they saw the lights of the ranch glowing in the distance. Mary was waiting when they rode in, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" "Get every blanket we have," Caleb said, dismounting, "and send Tommy into town for the doctor." "The doctor?" Mary looked confused. "For a horse?" "Just do it," Caleb snapped, and Mary hurried off without another word. They got Nightfall into the barn and down onto a thick bed of hay. The stallion was trembling violently now, his eyes glazed with pain, and Ara knelt beside him, stroking his neck and whispering soothing words that felt hollow and useless. Caleb crouched on the other side, his hand resting on the horse's shoulder. "He shouldn't have survived this long," he said quietly. "He's strong," Ara said, her voice fierce. "He's not giving up." "Neither are you." She looked up at him, and in the lamplight, she could see the exhaustion and grief written across his face. "If you'd lost him tonight," she said softly, "you'd never forgive yourself. Would you?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No, I wouldn't." "Then let me try to save him, please." He reached across Nightfall's body and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "All right," he said. "We try." The doctor arrived near midnight, a grizzled old man named Hollis, who looked like he'd seen everything the frontier had to throw at him. He examined Nightfall's leg with steady hands and a grim expression, then sat back on his heels. "It's bad," he said. "Bones shattered in 3 places. Even if we set it, there's no guarantee it'll heal right, and the infection risk." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Can you fix it?" Ara asked. "I can try," Hollis said, "but I'm a doctor, not a veterinarian. I've set broken bones on people, not horses. And even if I do everything right, the odds are against us." "What are the odds?" Caleb asked. Hollis met his eyes. 1 in 10, maybe less." The barn went quiet. Even the other horses seemed to sense the weight of the moment, standing still in their stalls. Ara looked down at Nightfall, at the magnificent animal who'd saved them all, and felt something crack open inside her chest. 1 in 10 is better than 0, she said. Hollis nodded slowly. "All right then, let's get to work." What followed was hours of brutal, painstaking effort. Hollis worked with the kind of steady precision that came from decades of practice, setting the bone fragments, stitching torn flesh, wrapping the leg in splints and bandages. Ara held Nightfall's head in her lap, stroking his face and talking to him in a constant stream of quiet words while Caleb held the lamp and handed Hollis whatever he needed. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the barn doors, Hollis was washing blood off his hands and Nightfall was unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. "That's all I can do," Hollis said, drying his hands on a towel. "Now it's up to him. If he makes it through the next 3 days without infection, he's got a fighting chance. But he needs to stay still, and he needs constant care. Someone's got to be with him day and night, watching for fever, changing bandages, keeping him calm." "I'll do it," Ara said immediately. Hollis looked at her, then at Caleb. "You understand what that means? No sleep, no rest. Just sitting here waiting to see if he lives or dies." "I understand," Ara said. Caleb squeezed her shoulder. "I'll help. We'll take shifts." Hollis packed up his bag and stood, his old bones creaking. "You're both crazy," he said, but there was something like respect in his voice. "But I hope to hell it works." After he left, Caleb and Ara sat in the quiet barn, watching Nightfall's chest rise and fall. The exhaustion was catching up with both of them, but neither moved. "You should get some sleep," Caleb said finally. "So should you." "I'm not leaving him." "Neither am I." Caleb smiled, tired and sad. "Stubborn." "You already knew that." They sat in silence for a while, and then Caleb spoke again, his voice quiet. "When my daughter got sick, I sat with her like this. 3 days and 3 nights, watching her fight something I couldn't see and couldn't stop. And when she finally—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "When she died, I thought I'd never feel that helpless again." Otto reached over and took his hand. "You're not helpless now. You're fighting." "We're fighting," he corrected, his fingers tightening around hers. "Together." And in that moment, sitting in the straw-dusted barn with a dying horse and the weight of their shared grief pressing down on them, something shifted. The walls they'd both built around their hearts cracked a little wider, letting in just enough light to see each other clearly. The next 3 days were the longest of Ara's life. She and Caleb took turns sitting with Nightfall, monitoring his breathing, checking for fever, coaxing him to drink water when he woke. Mary brought food that mostly went uneaten, and Roy stopped by to offer quiet words of encouragement. The rest of the ranch moved around them like a distant world they were no longer part of. Silas didn't come near the barn, but Ara could feel his presence like a shadow at the edge of everything, waiting. On the second night, Nightfall's fever spiked. His body burned with heat, and he thrashed weakly, his eyes rolling white with pain. Otta held his head while Caleb sponged him down with cool water, both of them working frantically to bring the temperature down. "Come on," Otta whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't give up now, please." The fever broke just before dawn, leaving Nightfall weak and trembling but alive. Ara collapsed against the stall wall, sobbing with relief, and Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried. "He's going to make it," Caleb said, his voice rough. "He's going to make it." On the third day, Nightfall lifted his head and drank water on his own. The fire came back into his eyes, just a flicker, but it was enough. Ara laughed, a sound halfway between joy and exhaustion, and pressed her forehead against the stallion's neck. "You stubborn, beautiful bastard," she whispered. "You did it." Caleb was standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression she'd never seen before. It was raw and open, and full of something that looked like hope. "Ara," he said softly. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up, for making me fight when I wanted to quit, for all of it." She stood and walked over to him, her legs shaky from exhaustion. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "You came here with nothing, and you've given this place something it hasn't had in years. Life, hope, a reason to keep going." Her breath caught. "Caleb, I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice low and intense. "But I know I don't want to go back to the way things were before. I don't want to be alone anymore." "Neither do I," she whispered. He leaned down and kissed her, gentle and tentative, like he was afraid she might disappear. And for the first time since the trail had taken everything from her, Ara felt like she'd finally come home. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was fully up, streaming through the barn doors and turning the dust motes into floating gold. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the kiss hadn't already told them. Nightfall nickered softly from his stall, breaking the moment, and Otta laughed, the sound watery and exhausted. "I think someone's jealous." "He's got no room to complain," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "He's got you all to himself most of the time." Otta stepped back, suddenly self-conscious, and wiped at her face. She probably looked terrible, covered in dirt and hay and dried tears, but Caleb was looking at her like she was something precious, and that made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief. "I should clean up," she said. "You should sleep," Caleb corrected. "I'll stay with him." "Caleb, you haven't slept in 3 days, Otta. You're dead on your feet." He took her shoulders gently, turning her toward the door. "Go. Rest. I promise I'll come get you if anything changes." She wanted to argue, but her body was screaming for rest, and she knew he was right. 2 hours, she said. "Then you wake me." 4. 3. His mouth quirked into a smile. "Deal." She left the barn on shaking legs and made it to her room before her body gave out completely. She collapsed onto the narrow bed fully clothed and was asleep before her head hit the pillow. When she woke, the light slanting through the window told her it had been much longer than 3 hours. She sat up, disoriented and groggy, and stumbled outside to find the sun already past its peak. Mary was hanging laundry near the cookhouse, and she smiled when she saw Ara. "About time you woke up," Mary said. "Boss said to let you sleep." "How long has it been?" 6 hours, give or take." "Damn it!" Ara headed toward the barn, her heart pounding. "How's Nightfall?" "Resting easy, last I heard. Boss is still with him." Ara found Caleb exactly where she'd left him, sitting on a hay bale next to Nightfall's stall, his head tipped back against the wall and his eyes closed. He looked exhausted, lines of worry carved deep around his mouth. But when she stepped closer, he opened his eyes and smiled. "You're supposed to be sleeping," she said. "So are you. You lied about the 3 hours. You needed more than 3 hours." He stood, stretching, and she heard his spine pop. "He's been quiet. Drinking when I offer it. No fever. I think we're through the worst of it." Ara moved to the stall and looked in at Nightfall. The stallion's eyes were clearer now, the pain-glazed look gone, and when he saw her, he lifted his head slightly. She reached through the slats and stroked his muzzle, relief flooding through her so strong it made her knees weak. "Hey, boy," she whispered, You scared the hell out of me." Nightfall blew out a soft breath against her palm, and she could have sworn he understood. Caleb came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "We should talk," he said quietly. "About what happened this morning." "About Silas." The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the moment. Ada turned to face him, her stomach tightening. "What about him?" "I'm firing him," Caleb said, his voice flat and final. "Today. What he did out there driving those cattle toward the cliff, it wasn't an accident. And even if I didn't have proof, I can't have a foreman I don't trust. He's going to fight you on it." "Let him." Caleb's jaw set. "This is my ranch. My decision." And he's done. Aura wanted to feel relieved, but all she felt was dread. Men like Silas didn't go quietly. They burned everything on their way out. "Be careful," she said. "He's dangerous." "I know." Caleb touched her face, just briefly, his fingers warm against her skin. "But so am I when someone threatens what's mine." The way he said it, the possessiveness in his voice, sent heat rushing through her. She wasn't sure if he meant the ranch or something else, but either way, it made her breath catch. "When are you going to do it?" she asked. "Soon as I find him." Caleb stepped back, his expression hardening into something colder. "Stay here with Nightfall. I don't want you anywhere near this." "Caleb, please, Ara." His voice softened, just a fraction. "Let me handle this." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she could take care of herself, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't trying to protect her because he thought she was weak. He was trying to protect her because he cared, and that was different. "All right," she said, "but if he comes after you." "He won't." Caleb leaned down and kissed her forehead, quick and gentle. "I'll be back soon." He left, and Ara stood there in the quiet barn, listening to his footsteps fade. Then she went into Nightfall's stall and sat down in the straw beside him, resting her hand on his neck. The stallion sighed and lowered his head into her lap, and they stayed like that, two survivors waiting for the storm they both knew was coming. Caleb found Silas in the bunkhouse, packing his saddlebags. Word must have already spread because the other hands were conspicuously absent, and the building was empty except for the two of them. Silas looked up when Caleb walked in, and his face twisted into something ugly. "Come to gloat?" Silas asked. "Come to make sure you're gone by sundown," Caleb said. "You're fired." "Yeah, I figured." Silas threw a shirt into his bag with more force than necessary. 5 years I've worked this ranch. 5 years of keeping this place running while you sat up in that house drowning in whiskey and self-pity. And this is the thanks I get? "You tried to kill my cattle," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You cut that fence. You drove them toward the cliffs, and you did it because you were jealous of a woman who's been here 2 months. Jealous?" Silas laughed, harsh and bitter. "You think this is about jealousy? This is about watching you throw away everything I've built because some trail trash widow shows up and bats her eyes at you." Caleb's fist connected with Silas's jaw before he'd even realized he was moving. The foreman went down hard, blood blooming from his split lip, and Caleb stood over him, his chest heaving. "You don't talk about her," Caleb said, his voice shaking with rage. "You don't even think about her, you hear me?" Silas spat blood onto the floor and laughed again, the sound wet and vicious. "You really think she cares about you? She's using you, same as everyone else. Soon as she gets what she wants, she'll be gone." "Get out," Caleb said. "Now, before I do something we both regret." Silas pushed himself to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. His eyes were cold and empty, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and full of promise. "This isn't over. You're going to regret choosing her over me." "I already regret ever hiring you," Caleb said. "Now get off my land." Silas grabbed his bags and walked out, and Caleb stood there in the empty bunkhouse, his knuckles throbbing and his heart pounding. He'd made an enemy today, a real one, and he had no idea what Silas would do next, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came, he'd face it, because Otto was worth fighting for. Silas left the ranch that afternoon, riding out on a gray gelding with his saddlebags slung behind him and hate etched into every line of his face. The hands watched him go in silence, and when he was finally out of sight, Roy let out a long breath. "Good riddance," he muttered. "Don't celebrate yet," another hand said. "Men like that don't just disappear." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, and no one disagreed. That night, Caleb came to find Otta in the barn. She was sitting with nightfall again, reading aloud from an old book she'd found in the main house, something about explorers and distant lands. The stallion seemed to like the sound of her voice, his breathing steady and calm. Caleb leaned against the stall door just watching her, and when she finally noticed him, she closed the book. "How'd it go?" "He's gone." "For good?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but he's off the ranch, and that's what matters." Otta set the book aside and stood, brushing straw off her skirt. "What about the other hands? Do they know why you fired him?" "They know enough." Caleb opened the stall door and stepped inside, moving carefully so he didn't spook nightfall. "Roy's taking over as foreman. He's solid. The men respect him." "That's good." "Yeah." Caleb crouched down next to the stallion, running his hand along Nightfall's neck. The horse's eyes were half closed, peaceful, and Caleb's expression softened. "I never thought I'd see him like this. Calm, trusting." "He just needed someone to believe in him," Otta said quietly. Caleb looked up at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "So did I." The words hung between them, raw and honest, and Otta felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about grief or loneliness or two broken people clinging to each other in the dark. This was something real, something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "Caleb," she started, but he cut her off. "I know it's fast," he said, standing. "I know we barely know each other, and you've got every reason to be cautious, but I need you to know something." He stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I haven't felt alive in 5 years, not until you showed up, and I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want to lose this." "You're not going to lose me," Otta said, her voice shaking. "I'm not going anywhere." "Promise me." "I promise." He kissed her then, deeper this time, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had. They stood there in the straw-dusted barn with Nightfall breathing softly beside them, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Otta felt whole. The weeks that followed were some of the best of Ara's life. Nightfall's recovery was slow but steady, and under her constant care, the stallion began to heal. The swelling in his leg went down, the wound closed cleanly, and day by day, he grew stronger. Otta spent hours with him, massaging the injured leg, encouraging him to bear weight on it, celebrating every small victory like it was a miracle. Caleb was there for most of it, working alongside her, and the bond between the three of them deepened into something unshakable. The ranch hands noticed, of course. They noticed the way Caleb looked at Otta, the way his whole face softened when she walked into a room. They noticed the way she smiled at him, open and unguarded in a way she'd never been before. And slowly, grudgingly, they started treating her less like an outsider and more like one of them. Mary was the first to say it out loud. She cornered Otta in the kitchen one afternoon, her arms crossed, and a knowing look on her face. "You and the boss," she said. "It's serious." Otta felt her cheeks heat. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't play coy with me, girl. I've got eyes." Mary smiled, warm and genuine. "And I'm glad. He's been dead inside for too long. You brought him back." "He brought himself back," Otta said quietly. "I just gave him a reason." "Same thing." Mary squeezed her shoulder. "Just don't hurt him. He's been through enough." "I won't," Otta promised, and meant it. But happiness, she was learning, was fragile on the frontier. Just when you thought you'd finally found solid ground, something came along to shake it loose. It started with the cattle. Roy noticed it first. 3 head missing from the south pasture, the fence cut clean through. Then 5 more from the east ridge. Then a water trough poisoned, killing 6 steers before anyone realized what had happened. Each incident was small, isolated, easy to dismiss as bad luck or predators. But taken together, they formed a pattern. Someone was sabotaging the ranch. Caleb called a meeting in the main barn, his face grim. The hands gathered around him, their expressions tense, and Ara stood in the back, her arms crossed. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Caleb said. "Someone's targeting us, deliberately, and I think we all know who." "Silas," Roy said, his voice flat. Caleb nodded. "He's holed up somewhere close, probably with a few men he's hired on. and he's trying to bleed us dry, one head of cattle at a time. So what do we do? One of the younger hands asked. We double the patrols, Caleb said. 2 men on watch at all times, rotating every 4 hours. No one rides alone. And if you see Silas or anyone working with him, you come find me. Don't engage. Understood? The men nodded, their faces hard, and the meeting broke up. Otto stayed behind, waiting until everyone else had left before approaching Caleb. He's not going to stop, she said quietly. I know. So what's the plan? Caleb looked at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes made her ache. I don't know yet, but I'm working on it. Let me help. Don't shut me out, she said, stepping closer. We're in this together, remember? You said so yourself. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't want you in danger. Too late for that. She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. Whatever happens, we face it. Together. Caleb stared at their joined hands, then pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. I don't deserve you, he muttered against her hair. Yes, you do, she said. You just forgot for a while. The attacks continued, a barn fire that they caught just in time, fences cut in 3 different places on the same night, a stampede triggered by gunshots in the middle of the night, scattering cattle across miles of open range. Each time they fought back, patched the damage, and kept going. But it was taking a toll. The hands were exhausted, the cattle were skittish, and the ranch was hemorrhaging money. Ara threw herself into the work, doing whatever needed to be done. She rode fence lines, helped drive scattered cattle, stayed up through the night on watch shifts. And through it all, nightfall continued to heal. 6 weeks after the injury, he was walking without a limp. 8 weeks, and he was trotting around the corral, his movements still careful but growing stronger every day. He's going to be all right, Ada told Caleb one evening, watching the stallion move across the pen. He's really going to be all right. Caleb stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and nodded. Thanks to you. Thanks to both of us, she corrected. And to him. He's a fighter. So are you. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, and tried not to think about the fact that everything they'd built was under attack. Tried not to think about Silas out there in the darkness, plotting his next move. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still coming. It came on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after Silas had been fired. Ara was in the barn with nightfall when she heard shouting from the yard. She ran outside to find Roy and 2 other hands gathered around Caleb, their faces pale with shock. What happened? She asked, her heart already pounding. Caleb turned to her, and the fury in his eyes made her step back. They hit the main herd, drove off at least 100 head, maybe more. How? Cut through the north fence and used torches to spook them. By the time we got there, they were gone. He was shaking with rage, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. This isn't raiding anymore. This is war. Where's the herd now? Ada asked. Scattered across 15 miles of open country. It'll take us days to round them up, and by then, Silas will have hit us again. So we hit him first, Roy said, his voice hard. We know where he's camped. We ride out there, we end this. And if someone gets killed, Caleb shot back, if one of you takes a bullet because I dragged you into my fight? This is our fight too, Roy said. We work this ranch. We bleed for it, and we're not going to sit here and let him destroy it. The other hands murmured agreement, and Otto could see the conflict tearing Caleb apart. He wanted to protect them, but he also knew Roy was right. They couldn't keep playing defense. Give me a day, Caleb said finally. Let me think this through. If we're going to do this, we do it smart. Roy nodded, and the group dispersed, leaving Caleb and Otto alone in the yard. He stood there with his head bowed, and she could see the weight of it crushing him. Hey, she said softly, touching his arm. Look at me. He lifted his head, and the pain in his eyes nearly broke her. You're not alone in this, she said. You've got good men who are willing to fight. You've got me, and you've got Nightfall, who's stronger now than he's ever been. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to focus on her. We're going to get through this, but you have to let us help. I can't lose you, he said, his voice cracking. If something happens to you because of me, nothing's going to happen to me, she interrupted. Because I'm not stupid, and I'm not reckless, but I'm also not sitting on the sidelines while you fight this alone. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. And you love me for it. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and for a moment everything went still. Then Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching hers. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. Her breath caught. You do? I love you, Ada. I think I have since the day you stood between me and that horse and refused to back down. He smiled, sad and tired and real. You scared the hell out of me, still do. Tears burned her eyes, and she laughed, the sound shaky. I love you too, even though you're impossible and stubborn and you never sleep. We're a perfect match then. He kissed her, and it felt like a promise, a vow that no matter what came next, they'd face it together. The next day, Caleb gathered everyone in the barn and laid out his plan. They weren't going to raid Silas's camp. That was what he expected, and it would get people killed. Instead, they were going to set a trap. We let him think we're vulnerable, Caleb said. We pull back the patrols, make it look like we're giving up, and when he comes for the rest of the herd, we'll be waiting. What if he doesn't come? One of the hands asked. He will, Caleb said. He's not doing this for the cattle. He's doing it to hurt me, and he won't be able to resist the chance to finish it. The plan was risky, and everyone knew it, but it was their best shot, and they all agreed to try. They spent 2 days setting it up. They pulled the patrols, left the fences unguarded, and moved the main herd to a narrow valley where Silas would have to come through a bottleneck to reach them. Then they waited, hidden in the rocks above, rifles loaded and ready. Ara was there too, despite Caleb's protests. She'd argued that they needed every gun they could get, and finally, he'd relented. She crouched beside him in the cold darkness, her rifle resting on her knees, and watched the valley below. You scared? Caleb asked quietly. Terrified, she admitted. Me too. They waited through the night, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe, and just before dawn, when the sky was starting to lighten at the edges, they heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming fast. Silas and his men rode into the valley like ghosts, their faces hidden by scarves, torches blazing. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, and they moved with the confidence of men who thought they'd already won. Caleb raised his rifle. Wait, he said quietly. Let them get close. The riders fanned out, starting to drive the cattle toward the narrow pass. And then Caleb stood, his rifle leveled, and his voice rang out across the valley. That's far enough. The riders froze. Torches flickered in the pre-dawn light, and then Silas pulled down his scarf, his face twisted with rage. You son of a bitch, he spat. Drop your weapons, Caleb said. All of you, this ends now. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of Silas's men reached for his gun, and all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted across the valley, shattering the pre-dawn quiet into chaos. Ara dropped flat against the rocks as bullets whined overhead, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Below, the cattle scattered in blind panic, their bellows mixing with the crack of rifles and the shouting of men. Caleb was firing steadily beside her, his face set in grim concentration. Stay down, he yelled over the noise. She couldn't see who was hitting what, just muzzle flashes in the dim light, and figures moving through the dust and smoke. One of Silas's men went down, then another. Roy and the other hands were firing from the opposite ridge, creating a crossfire that left Silas's group with nowhere to run. But Silas himself was riding hard toward the narrow pass, spurring his horse like he thought he could break through. Caleb saw him and stood, taking aim, but his rifle clicked empty. He swore and grabbed for more ammunition, and that's when Otto saw what he couldn't see from where he was standing. One of Silas's men had circled around behind them, rifle raised, aiming straight at Caleb's back. She didn't think, just moved. She brought her rifle up and fired, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, and the man jerked and fell from his horse. Caleb spun around, saw what she'd done, and his face went white. Are you hit? He shouted, grabbing her shoulders. No, I'm fine. She was shaking, the rifle trembling in her hands, but she was fine. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. 4 of Silas's men were down. 2 more had their hands raised in surrender, and Silas himself was trapped at the mouth of the pass with rifles pointed at him from 3 directions. His horse was limping, blood streaming from a graze on its shoulder, and Silas looked like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse. Get down, Caleb ordered, his rifle trained on Silas. Slow! Silas dismounted, his movements jerky with rage and defeat. Blood was running from a cut on his temple, and his eyes were wild. "You should have just let me have the ranch," he said, his voice hoarse. "I could have made it something great." "It was never yours to have," Caleb said. "I worked for it. I bled for it. And you threw it all away for that whore." Caleb moved so fast Ara barely saw it. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and hit Silas so hard the man crumpled to the ground. Then Caleb was on him, fists flying, all the rage and grief and fear of the past months pouring out in a violence that was as terrifying as it was raw. Roy and 2 others pulled him off before he could kill Silas, dragging him back while Silas coughed and spat blood into the dirt. "That's enough, boss," Roy said quietly. "He's done." Caleb was breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding, and when he looked at Ara, the wildness in his eyes made her chest ache. She moved to him, taking his face in her hands. "It's over," she said softly. "He can't hurt us anymore." Caleb closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, and she felt the fight drain out of him. "I almost lost you," he whispered. "But you didn't. I'm right here." They tied Silas and his men and loaded them onto horses, then sent 2 of the hands to bring the sheriff from Blackwater Ridge. It would take most of the day, but nobody was arguing about waiting. What Silas had done, the sabotage and theft and attempted murder, would land him in prison for years. Maybe forever. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold, Ara stood with Caleb and watched the cattle settle. The herd was scattered but intact, and the ranch hands were already starting to drive them back toward home. It wasn't perfect. 2 men had minor injuries, several cattle were lost, and the whole thing had been far too close. But they'd survived. "You saved my life back there," Caleb said, his voice rough. "You've saved mine a dozen times over," Ara replied. "I figured I owed you." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and they stood there while the valley slowly came back to life around them. "I want you to know something," he said after a while. "This ranch, everything I have, half of it's yours. I'm making it legal, drawing up papers." Ara pulled back to look at him. "Caleb, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." His expression was fierce, determined. "You fought for this place as hard as anyone. You brought Nightfall back from the dead, you stood up to Silas, you saved my life. This is as much yours as it is mine." "I don't want your ranch," she said quietly. "Then what do you want?" She looked at him, at this man who'd been broken and bitter, and who'd somehow found his way back to being whole, and she knew exactly what she wanted. "You," she said simply. "Just you." His eyes softened, and he kissed her, gentle and deep, while the morning sun turned everything golden, and the sound of cattle and men working drifted across the valley like a promise. The ride back to the ranch felt different, lighter, like a weight they'd all been carrying had finally lifted. The hands were laughing and joking, the tension that had gripped the place for months finally broken. Roy rode up beside Ara and Caleb, a rare smile on his weathered face. "You 2 make a hell of a team," he said. "We do all right," Caleb replied, and the pride in his voice made Ara's chest warm. When they finally reached the ranch, Mary was waiting on the porch, her hands twisted in her apron. She let out a cry of relief when she saw them all alive and mostly unhurt, and within minutes the entire place was buzzing with the story of what had happened. The hands who'd stayed behind to guard the ranch listened with wide eyes, and by the time the sun was setting, the whole thing had already taken on the quality of legend. Ara slipped away while everyone was still celebrating, heading to the barn where Nightfall was waiting. The stallion nickered when he saw her, limping over to the stall door, and she felt tears prick her eyes. His leg was still healing, still weak, but he was alive, and that was more than she'd dared to hope for. "We did it," she told him, stroking his nose. "We won." The stallion blew out a soft breath, and she leaned her forehead against his, feeling the warmth of him, the steady proof of life. She'd come to this ranch with nothing, expecting nothing, and somehow she'd found everything. "There you are." She turned to find Caleb standing in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the setting sun. He looked exhausted, his shirt torn and dusty, his hands bandaged, but he was smiling. "Thought I'd check on him," Ada said. Caleb walked over, moving slowly like every muscle hurt, and put his hand on Nightfall's neck. "He looks good, stronger every day. He'll be ready to ride again soon, not long rides, but enough." Good. Caleb looked at her, his expression turning serious. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago. Ada's stomach fluttered. What is it? When you showed up here, I was half dead inside, going through the motions. I'd convinced myself that's all I deserved, that I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it, and that was that. He took her hands, his grip warm and steady. But you changed everything. You made me remember what it feels like to care about something, to fight for something, to believe that maybe the future could be different than the past. Caleb, let me finish. He squeezed her hands gently. I know I'm not easy. I'm stubborn, and I carry too much weight, and I probably always will. But I want to build something with you, a real life, a real future, not just surviving day to day, but actually living. Ada felt tears sliding down her cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. That's all I've wanted since the day Thomas died, to have a reason to keep going that was bigger than just not giving up. Then marry me, Caleb said, and his voice was shaking. Not because you need the ranch or the security or any of that. Marry me because you want to wake up next to me every morning. Because you want to fight with me over stupid things and laugh at the dinner table and fall asleep knowing you're not alone. Marry me because this, us, is real. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. So she just nodded over and over until he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could feel his heartbeat against hers. Yes, she finally managed. Yes, I'll marry you. They stood there in the quiet barn while the sun dipped below the horizon and the ranch settled into evening, and for the first time since she'd lost everything, Ada felt like she'd finally come home. The wedding happened 3 weeks later, simple and quick, with just the ranch hands and Mary and a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. Ada wore a dress that Mary had helped her make, pale blue cotton that wasn't fancy but fit her perfectly. Caleb wore his best shirt and looked so nervous she almost laughed. They said their vows standing on the porch of the main house, with nightfall watching from the corral and the whole prairie spread out behind them like a blessing. Roy stood as witness, trying not to cry and failing, and when the preacher pronounced them married, the entire ranch erupted in cheers. The celebration went late into the night, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Ada danced with Caleb, with Roy, with half the hands on the ranch, until her feet hurt and she couldn't stop smiling. And when the party finally wound down and everyone drifted off to their bunks, she and Caleb walked hand in hand to the house that was now theirs together. You tired? Caleb asked as they climbed the stairs. Exhausted, Ada admitted, but happy. Me too. They reached the bedroom and Caleb paused, suddenly awkward. I should tell you, I haven't, shared this room with anyone since... I know, Ada said gently. We don't have to rush anything. But when she kissed him, slow and sweet, he kissed her back with a hunger that spoke of months of loneliness and longing. They moved to the bed, fumbling with buttons and laces, laughing when things didn't cooperate. And when they finally came together, it was messy and imperfect and absolutely right. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Caleb's arm around her and her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slowly return to normal. I love you, he said into the darkness. I love you too, she replied, even when you snore. I don't snore. You absolutely do. He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest, and pulled her closer. We're going to be all right, aren't we? Yes, Ada said and meant it. We're going to be just fine. The next few months passed in a blur of hard work and quiet happiness. With Silas gone and the sabotage ended, the ranch began to thrive again. The cattle fattened on summer grass, buyers came through offering good prices, and slowly, steadily, Blackthorn Ranch found its footing. Ara worked alongside Caleb every day, learning the business side of ranching, dealing with buyers and suppliers, managing the books. It turned out she had a head for numbers, and more than once Caleb told her she was better at it than he'd ever been. She also continued working with Nightfall, and by late summer the Stallion was sound enough to ride. The first time she swung into the saddle, her heart was in her throat. Nightfall shifted beneath her, testing, and she half expected him to explode. But he didn't. He stood steady, ears forward, waiting, and when she nudged him into a walk, he moved with the careful precision of an animal who knew his own limits but refused to let them define him. Caleb watched from the fence, his face tight with emotion. He's really doing it, he said, wonder in his voice. He's a survivor, Ara replied. just like the rest of us. By autumn, nightfall was cantering across the valley, his stride a little uneven but strong, and watching him run felt like watching a miracle. The ranch hands stopped to stare whenever Ara rode him, and the story of the savage stallion who'd been saved spread through the territory like wildfire. People started coming by just to see him, and more than once Caleb had to turn away offers to buy the horse for ridiculous sums of money. "He's not for sale," Caleb always said. "Not now. Not ever." One afternoon in early October, Ara and Caleb rode out to the northern ridge where the whole valley spread out below them. The leaves were turning gold and red, and the air had that crisp quality that promised winter was coming. They sat on their horses side by side, Nightfall and Caleb's bay gelding standing easy, and just looked. "You ever think about the day you showed up here?" Caleb asked. "All the time," Ara said. "I was so lost, so sure I didn't have anything left to offer the world. And now? Now I know that's what grief does. It makes you believe you're empty, that there's nothing left inside you worth saving." She looked at him, this man who'd taken a chance on her when no one else would. "But that's a lie. There's always something left. You just have to find someone brave enough to help you see it." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "You did that for me too, you know. I thought I was doing you a favor by letting you stay, but really, you were saving me." "We saved each other," Ara corrected. "That's how it works." They rode back to the ranch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. When they reached the barn, Ara found a letter waiting for her, delivered by a rider from town. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and when she opened it, her breath caught. It was from a lawyer in Denver. The widow of a man named Thomas Holloway had been listed as a beneficiary in a distant relative's will. A small inheritance, nothing grand, but enough to provide security. Enough to prove that she hadn't been forgotten. Ara read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. She'd use some of it to improve the ranch, she decided. Maybe build a new barn or buy better breeding stock. The rest she'd save, a cushion against the hard years that the frontier always delivered sooner or later. That evening, she and Caleb sat on the porch watching the stars come out. She told him about the letter, and he smiled, genuinely happy for her. "You earned that," he said. "I earned this," she corrected, gesturing to the ranch, to the life they'd built. "That's just money." "Still, it's good. It means you've got options." "I don't need options." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder. "I've got everything I want right here." Winter came hard and fast that year, the first snow falling in late November and not letting up until the entire valley was buried in white. The work was brutal, checking on cattle in freezing temperatures, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed through drifts that came up to their knees. But they managed. Together. Ara learned to read the weather the way Caleb did, watching the sky for signs of incoming storms. She learned which cattle were troublemakers and which were steady. She learned the rhythm of the ranch in winter, the quiet mornings and the exhausted evenings, and the way everything slowed down under the weight of snow. And through it all, Nightfall thrived. His leg had healed as well as it was ever going to, leaving him with a slight limp that only showed when he was tired. But he was strong and healthy, and on the rare clear days, Ara would ride him across the frozen prairie, feeling the power in his stride and the trust in the way he responded to her hands. "You two are something else," Roy said one afternoon, watching them work together. "Never seen anything like it." "He just needed someone to believe in him," Ara said, the same thing she'd told Caleb all those months ago. "So did you," Roy replied and tipped his hat as he walked away. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts, and with it came new life. The cattle began dropping calves, the grass pushed up through the mud, and the ranch woke up from its winter sleep. Ada spent her days checking on newborns, doctoring sick animals, and working alongside the hands to repair fences and equipment. And one morning in early April, she woke up sick. It happened 3 days in a row before Mary noticed. The older woman found Ara bent over a bucket behind the barn, her face pale and clammy, and put 2 and 2 together immediately. "How late are you?" Mary asked bluntly. Ara straightened, wiping her mouth. "What?" "Your monthly. How late?" Ara's heart stopped. She'd been so busy she hadn't even thought about it, but now that Mary mentioned it, she realized she couldn't remember the last time. 6 weeks, she said slowly. "Maybe 7, Mary smiled, warm and knowing. "You need to tell him." Tell him what? I don't even know for sure. You know, Mary interrupted. A woman always knows. Ada told Caleb that night after dinner when they were alone on the porch watching the stars. She was terrified, her hands shaking, because she had no idea how he'd react. He'd lost a child before, lost a wife. What if he couldn't handle the thought of going through that again? I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb turned to her, concern flickering across his face. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think it is. She took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Caleb just stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Ada felt panic rising in her chest. Say something, she whispered. Are you sure? His voice was hoarse, strained. Pretty sure. Mary thinks so too. Caleb stood abruptly, and for a terrible moment Ada thought he was going to walk away. But instead he knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his, and she saw tears streaming down his face. I thought I'd never get another chance, he said, his voice breaking. I thought that part of my life was over. Are you happy? Ada asked, because she genuinely couldn't tell. Happy? He laughed, the sound wet and incredulous. Ada, I'm terrified. I'm so scared something will go wrong, that I'll lose you or the baby, or both, and I don't know if I can survive that again. You won't lose us, she said firmly, cupping his face. I'm strong, and this baby is going to be strong, and we're going to be fine. You can't promise that. No, she admitted, but I can promise I'll fight like hell, for this baby, for us, for everything we've built. Caleb pulled her into his arms and held her while he cried, all the fear and grief and hope pouring out of him in great shuddering sobs. And Ada held him back, this man who'd saved her and who she'd saved in return, and knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The pregnancy was hard. Ada was sick for months, losing weight she couldn't afford to lose, and there were nights when Caleb sat up with her, holding her hair back while she retched, his face gray with worry. But slowly, steadily, she got through it. By summer, the sickness had passed, and she started to show, her belly rounding under her work dresses. The ranch hands treated her like she was made of glass, trying to take over her chores, but Ada wasn't having it. She worked right up until the last month, stubbornly insisting she was fine, driving Caleb crazy with worry. You're going to hurt yourself, he said for the 100th time, watching her haul a bucket of feed. I'm pregnant, not dying, she shot back. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Not my wife, he muttered, taking the bucket from her. The baby came on a cold October night, almost exactly a year after Ada had arrived at the ranch. The labor was long and brutal, and there were moments when Ada thought she might not survive it. But Mary was there, steady and calm, and Caleb held her hand through every contraction, his face pale but determined. When the baby finally came, a squalling, red-faced girl with a shock of dark hair, Ada sobbed with relief and exhaustion. Caleb cut the cord with shaking hands, and when Mary placed the baby in Ada's arms, he sat on the edge of the bed and cried like his heart was breaking. She's perfect, he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand. She's absolutely perfect. What should we name her? Ada asked, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. Caleb looked at the baby, then at Ada, and smiled through his tears. Hope, he said. Her name is Hope. The first year of Hope's life was chaos. She was colicky and demanding, keeping them up at all hours, and Ada learned what true exhaustion felt like. But she also learned what joy felt like, watching Caleb with their daughter, seeing the way he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. He was a different man now, softer in some ways but stronger in others, and Ada fell in love with him all over again. Nightfall, impossibly, seemed to understand that there was a baby in the house. He stood quiet whenever Ada brought Hope out to the barn. His ears pricked forward, and once, when Hope cried, the stallion nickered softly, like he was trying to comfort her. He's going to be her first horse, Ada told Caleb one afternoon, watching Nightfall watch the baby. You think she'll ride? Caleb asked. I know she will. She's got your stubbornness and my determination. She won't have a choice. Caleb laughed and pulled Ada close, kissing the top of her head. I love you, he said. Both of you. More than I ever thought possible. I love you too, Ada replied, watching their daughter sleep in the sun and feeling the solid presence of the ranch around them. Years passed. Hope grew into a wild, fearless child who learned to ride almost before she could walk. The ranch prospered, the cattle multiplied, and Blackthorn became known throughout the territory as a place of quality and fairness. Otta and Caleb added 2 more children to their family, a boy they named Daniel after Caleb's brother, and another girl they called Rose. The river stone that Otta had carried across the frontier now sat on the mantel in the main house, the cornerstone of the home they'd built together. She looked at it sometimes and remembered the woman she'd been, broken and lost and sure she had nothing left to give, and she marveled at how wrong she'd been. Because courage, she'd learned, wasn't about being unbreakable. It wasn't about surviving alone or never feeling pain. Courage was about getting back up after life knocked you down. It was about opening your heart even when you were terrified of losing everything again. It was about believing that the future could be different than the past, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. And love, real love, wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone broken in all the same places you were and deciding to heal together. On a warm summer evening, when Hope was 5 and Daniel was 3 and Rose was barely a year old, Ara and Caleb stood on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Nightfall grazed in the pasture beyond, still strong despite his years, and the ranch stretched out around them in every direction, golden and green and alive. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Caleb asked, his arm around her waist. "All the time," Ara admitted. "If you'd turned me away that first day, if Nightfall had died on that cliff, if either of us had been too scared to try." "But we weren't," Caleb said. "No," Ara agreed, smiling as Hope shrieked with laughter and chased her brother across the grass. "We weren't, because in the end that was what mattered. Not the pain they'd survived or the losses they'd endured, but the choice they'd made to keep going. To believe that broken things could be mended, that savage hearts could learn to trust again, that 2 people who'd lost everything could find each other in the wilderness and build something beautiful from the wreckage. The frontier had tried to destroy them both. It had taken their loved ones, tested their limits, and pushed them to the edge of what they could endure. But they'd fought back, together. And in doing so, they discovered something the harsh land could never take away. They discovered that hope wasn't something you found. It was something you created, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until you looked around and realized you'd built a life worth living. And that, Ara thought, watching the sun set over the valley she now called home, was the greatest triumph of all.